Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and friends, we hope you've enjoyed the dinner this evening. It is becoming a tradition in the very short history of the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University to have an annual dinner to bring together conference participants, the Rice community, and the many generous supporters and friends of the Institute. Our principal guideline is to be a bridge between the world of ideas and action by bringing together the best scholars and practitioners from the private and public sectors to analyze and debate the key domestic and foreign policy issues and provide specific policy options and recommendations. I think that we can all agree that today's superb presentations by Jack Kemp and Janet Reno, along with the deliberations of our distinguished panelists, have served this purpose and have made, indeed, a difference in our nation's debate on the issues of tax policy that Jack Kemp addressed, urban crime and violence, and the devolution of governance. We look forward to tomorrow's panel discussions on tax policy, which promise to be equally informative and thought-provoking. I wish to take this occasion to thank all those at Rice University, the faculty, the staff, and the administration who worked so diligently to put this conference together. And I'm particularly grateful to my immediate staff at the Baker Institute for their dedication and hard work to make this all possible. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. James A. Baker III has served in senior government positions under 3 United States presidents. He served as the nation's 61st Secretary of State from January 1989 through August 92 under President George Bush. During his tenure at the State Department, Mr. Baker traveled to 90 foreign countries as the United States confronted the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of the post-Cold War era. Mr. Baker recently published A Politics of Diplomacy, his reflections on those years of revolution, war, and peace. I personally recommend a chapter on bladder diplomacy in Syria, which makes very interesting reading. Mr. Baker served as the 67th Secretary of the Treasury from 1985 to 1988 under President Ronald Reagan. As Treasury Secretary, he was also chairman of the President's Economic Policy Council. He served as White House Chief of Staff to President Reagan to 1985. And basically from 75, his record of public service began as Undersecretary of Commerce to Gerald Ford, and concluded, of course, with his service as White House Chief of Staff and Senior Counselor to President Bush from August 92 to January 93. Long active in American presidential politics, he led 5 presidential campaigns for Presidents Ford. It is my great honor to introduce James A. Baker III.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ambassador Dridgen. Ambassador Dridgen told you, yes, indeed, I was born here in Houston, Texas. That's because I wanted to be close to my mother. I hope that everyone who attended our conference today would agree that we had a terrific first day. I certainly thought we did, and I thought that the presentations were really marvelous. Before I begin my formal remarks this evening, I really would like to make a very special announcement. During the years that I served in public office, I really had an opportunity, particularly the 12 years that I was Chief of Staff for President Reagan and Treasury Secretary for President Reagan and Secretary of State for President Bush. I had an opportunity to meet very nearly all of the world's leaders. And in my opinion, at least, only a handful of those deserve that much overused expression, truly great. But one of those people was Yitzhak Rabin, who was struck down by an assassin just 1 year ago. When Yitzhak Rabin died, I lost a great friend. Israel lost a great prime minister, and the world lost a truly great statesman. In the aftermath of his murder, Susan and I began to think of ways that we could best honor the memory of this truly remarkable man, and we came upon the idea of an endowed position at the Baker Institute dedicated to extending Itzhak's legacy of peace and security in the Middle East. We talked to his widow, Leah, about this. She enthusiastically supported the idea, and the Baker Institute embarked on a fundraising campaign to establish an Itzhak Rabin Fellowship. And now, thanks to the generosity of the Brockstein family, I'm very proud to announce tonight the creation of the Isaac and Mildred Brockstein Fellowship in Peace and Security in honor of Itzhak Rabin. And I'd like to begin tonight by recognizing Raymond and Susan Brockstein and Bernard and Georgie Brockstein for their truly extraordinary gift, and I hope you'll all join me. And let me say to the Brocksteins that you have our appreciation, but you also have the appreciation of all of those around the world who admire Itzhak Rabin in his courageous quest for a just and a secure and a lasting peace. And now let me extend to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, my very personal appreciation for joining us here tonight. I would also like to recognize Gordon and Mary Kane, whose very generous support has made this conference possible. Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Mary. Also, thanks to Malcolm Gillis, the president of Rice University, for all that he's done over the course of these 3 short years that the Baker Institute's activities have been ongoing out there at Rice. He has really been tremendous, and without Malcolm's support, the Baker Institute would not be what it is today. And Malcolm, we thank you very much, and thank Rice University. Now, most of all, I want to thank our participants, our panel participants particularly, for helping us explore ways by which we can meet the domestic challenges confronting us at the threshold of a new century. We truly are honored by your presence, and we value your insights. Many of you came from a long ways away. I think we had a truly outstanding group of scholars, of academics, and of people from the world of action, like the mayor of Milwaukee, like the governor of Michigan, who is here, and others that I will mention a little bit later on during the course of my remarks. But it has become a truism, I think, of the 1990s to say that we live in revolutionary times. And if you listen to the presentations today, I think you would all agree that we live in revolutionary times. That was obvious, I think, from last year's first annual conference of the Baker Institute, when we were privileged to have President Bush here and General Powell, a number of the former foreign ministers with whom I served. It's quite obvious that we live in revolutionary times in foreign policy, where the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union have altered the geopolitical environment in some very, very fundamental ways. But it is also true of domestic affairs, where economic, political, and cultural change is driving an intense debate about the future course of our society. I think that we ought to welcome this debate. We had a little bit of that debate today during the course of one of our panels. As a matter of fact, we had a little bit this morning and a little bit this afternoon. I think it was very, very good. I think it was healthy. And I see this conference as playing an important part in advancing that debate. During our deliberations today and tomorrow, we're focusing on issues that are part of 3 broader domestic challenges facing us as a nation today, and it's about those 3 broader domestic challenges that I want to talk to you a little bit this evening. The first of those is revitalizing our economy. Jack Kemp this morning and others talked to you about the importance of tax reform and tax policy. I want to talk to you a little bit about the overall subject of revitalizing our economy. The second is reforming government and politics. And one of the discrete and specific issues embraced within that, of course, is devolution of government, which was the subject of our panel discussion this afternoon. And the third, broader domestic policy challenge is rehabilitating our society. And again, we talked about a specific element of that during the course of our discussions on urban crime and violence and the remarks, the outstanding remarks of the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, this morning on the subject. Let me begin with the first one, revitalizing our economy. Clearly, economic revitalization lies, I think, at the heart of any domestic policy agenda. We are, after all, the world's largest, richest, and most dynamic economy. Sometimes we forget that. We were reminded many times during the 1980s when I was Treasury Secretary that we were going to be overtaken by Japan or some other country. The United States was in decline. People were writing books about it. It didn't happen because it wasn't true. It wasn't true then, and it certainly isn't true today. Our workforce is the world's most productive. Our businesses are the most competitive in the world. They're the most competitive today, if I may say so, because we were steadfast in refusing to protect our industries. We had many industries come to us, particularly in the late 1980s, and ask for protection. And it was hard to say no. It's hard for political leaders to say, no, we're not going to protect you. You get out there, you downsize, and you compete in the world economy. But that's what we said, particularly to our automobile industry. John Engler knows that very well, and John Engler also knows that the automobile industry of the United States today is the most competitive automobile industry in the world. We can outcompete anybody in the world. Our technology is the world's most advanced, and yet all of these good things don't add up to the most outstanding economic performance in the world. Our performance has been fair to middling, I would say. Our overall economic performance remains a little bit disappointing. Recent growth has been low by post-World War II standards, averaging really only about 2.5% per year since 1973. I think a lot of the alarm that has been expressed in the United States over stagnant wages has been exaggerated. But there are nevertheless significant numbers of American workers, particularly the less skilled, who have seen little or no increase in their pay over the last 25 years. The solution to this problem, and it is a problem, and I think we ought to candidly admit it, and again, let me say Jack Kemp mentioned this specific fact in his remarks today, that growth can be increased and growth can be better, and that 2.5% is really not satisfactory for a country with the potential of the United States of America. The solution to the problem is not higher tariff barriers. It's not greater income redistribution, as a lot of people have suggested. It's really more robust overall growth. And again, that was the message, I think, that Jack Kemp brought us this morning. The fact of the matter is, as I said this morning, and I will reiterate here, I really believe that a rising tide does lift all boats. This, in turn, though, to get that additional growth and to achieve that rising tide is going to require reform of our current tax regime. It seems to me that our goal ought to be a simplified system that lowers marginal rates, that reduces compliance costs to business, that rewards individual entrepreneurship, and that encourages personal savings. A consumption-based tax of the sort that we are going to be discussing at tomorrow's session would obviously promote these goals if the significant political problems to such a tax could be overcome. But let me say this, even as we investigate the possibility of totally replacing our current tax system, and it's certainly something that should be and will be carefully looked at, we should not allow, in my opinion at least, the perfect to drive out the possible. A streamlining of the tax code, less onerous taxation of capital, and a convergence, if not a unification, of tax rates are plainly achievable objectives it seems to me, in the short to medium term. And the achievement of those objectives would not, in my view, prejudice the possibility that we might be able to go further and totally replace the income tax with a consumption-based tax, again, if we can figure out the right way to overcome the political problems I mentioned. Tax reform, though, is really only part of the broader agenda of revitalizing our economy. We talked a little bit this morning in various panels, not just the initial one, but the subsequent ones as well, about the importance of reducing the federal deficit. We talked about how deficit reduction would impact the question of devolution of government to lower levels of government. Reduction of the federal deficit is also important, just like tax reform, maybe not as important in my view as tax reform, because I think the deficit is on a downward path, and I think with appropriate spending restraint we can keep it there. But a realistic deficit reduction program would undoubtedly cut long-term interest rates, it would encourage investment, and it would raise productivity. And of that there can be no doubt, in my view, based on 4 years as Treasury Secretary of this country. More importantly, reducing the deficit, if it's part of a broader program to scale back the cost of government, would diminish public claims on our national savings, and it would free substantial resources for more productive private sector use. In addition, I think we need to move more aggressively to reduce government regulation overall, particularly government regulation of the job-creating private sector. Estimates, again, vary, but there's little doubt that much federal regulation, however well-meaning it is, and most all of it is well-meaning, places unnecessary burdens on American businesses, and especially on the smallest of those businesses, which are the most dynamic and which are the businesses that create the most jobs in this country. We ought to redouble our efforts to open more foreign markets to our goods and services. We've made a lot of rhetorical commitments to free trade, both with the nations of the Pacific Basin and with the other nations of Latin America. It is time, I think, that we make good on these rhetorical commitments, and we ought to begin with the prompt negotiation of Chile's accession to the North American Free Trade Agreement. Let me turn now to the second broader challenge that I think confronts us today, and that's reform of our governmental and political system. The need for that reform is imperative. I think it's fair to say that public confidence in government has never been lower, and if you don't believe that, just look at the turnout in the election that took place only 1 week ago. I think it was almost an historically low turnout. Certainly was the lowest turnout. I think it's around 49%, the lowest turnout in many, many years. Public cynicism about politics has never been higher. There's a growing sense that government is neither as effective nor is it as accountable as our citizens have a right to expect. Today's panel on devolution of governance explored one very important way in which the public's trust can be restored. And that, of course, is by returning power from Washington to states and municipalities. And Governor Engler said it very, very well in his opening comments. He also made the point, he said, I have this very quaint notion that this money that we're talking about up there in Washington really is our money. And it really is our money. And there ought to be some ways in which we can encourage the return of some of the powers that have gone up to Washington to lower levels of government. By doing that, we achieve several important objectives simultaneously. We would improve the effectiveness of government by permitting programs to be tailored to the specific needs of the communities involved. And we enhance government's accountability by shifting responsibility, and the panel discussion today made this very clear, by shifting responsibility from faceless Washington bureaucrats to people at lower levels of government who are more easily identifiable to the citizens who are going to hold them accountable. Perhaps most importantly of all, devolution of governance encourages the bold experimentation that lies at the heart of any successful public policy. I think it's very clear, for instance, that passage of federal welfare reform was driven in large part by the groundbreaking programs promoted by governors like John Engler, like Christie Whitman of New Jersey, and like Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin. Again, however, devolution of governance is only part of a broader agenda aimed at governmental and political reform. At the federal level, we clearly require measures to make our elected representatives less beholden to special interests and more responsive to the general public. One such measure, in my view, would be a constitutional amendment imposing term limits on federal legislative officials. Another would be a constitutional amendment mandating a balanced federal budget in normal economic times. These are things that are very, very popular with the American people. These are things that the American people support by overwhelming margins, and yet these are things that the Congress has not as yet seen fit to take that back. With respect to a balanced budget amendment, the Congress has passed it, the President wouldn't sign it. With respect to term limits, we haven't gotten it as yet through the Congress. Both of these proposed amendments, though, are long-standing, and as I said, both of them are supported by an overwhelming majority of our citizens. I think that their much delayed enactment would send a very clear message that our representatives are sensitive to the will of the American voter and not just to the need for re-election. There ought to be some other political reform high on our agenda. This is particularly true in the area of campaign finance, where the massive influx of so-called soft money has created the appearance, if not the reality, of candidates for sale to the highest bidder. Now, you heard Jack Kemp say we ought to get rid of all soft money this morning. I happen to agree with that. We ought to get rid of all soft money, not just soft money from PACs and individuals, but soft money from labor unions as well. But I think we ought to recognize that there are some legal and practical problems that are associated with imposing monetary limits on political contributions by American citizens in light of some of the decisions of the Supreme Court with respect to free speech. But I don't think any problems exist when it comes to requiring the prompt and complete public disclosure of all such contributions by amount and source, and we ought to do that, and we ought to do that pronto. Let me now turn to the third broad domestic challenge confronting us as we approach the end of the century, and that's under the broad heading of rehabilitating our society. Fostering private sector growth and fostering public sector reform is clearly critical to the future of this country. But we shouldn't forget the third pillar of we should not forget the third pillar of any successful nation, and that is a healthy civil society. I don't need to tell anybody in this room this evening that the civil society of our country is in trouble. In particular, we've seen a decline in the values that are necessary for any society to survive, much less flourish. This decline in values, of course, is most shockingly apparent in the area of public safety. While there has been welcome recent news on declining rates of violent crime in major urban areas, the prevalence of criminal behavior, especially among the youth of our inner cities, reminds us that millions of Americans today endure lives of fear. Today's panel on urban crime and violence addressed some very innovative ways in which we as a society can secure our neighborhoods from the threat of violent crime. It's clear, I think, that any such effort is probably doomed to fail without the full cooperation not just of individuals, but of local communities, as Dr. Saunders so well expressed in her remarks. True, we need more and better trained police officers. We need more imaginative local patrolling. We need speedier trials and stricter sentencing. But above all else, we need communities and individuals willing to accept responsibility for their own future. And I cannot stress that point too much. Violent crime is simply a particularly harrowing symptom, I think, of a broader national malady. Everywhere we see examples of individuals who are unwilling to accept responsibility for themselves or others. Youth resorting blithely to illegal drugs that can destroy their lives. Women bearing children they cannot support. Men abandoning their families when they are perceived to be burdens. Teachers unable or unwilling to impose the discipline necessary to teach our young what they need to know in order to succeed in today's information age. Our popular culture in this country is increasingly coarse. Our public discourse is unfortunately increasingly shrill. There are clear limits, of course, to what government can do to reverse this erosion in values, but government can, at a minimum, stop encouraging it. Like physicians, it seems to me the motto of government ought to be, first, do no harm. Yet sad to say, as our panelists I think all agreed today, our welfare system for decades did precisely that by encouraging dependence and irresponsibility among the least fortunate in our society. However, it is not government, but rather individuals that have to bear the primary responsibility for rehabilitating American society. It is parents, it is teachers, it is community leaders, police officers, and elected officials from councilperson to president that have to begin setting personal standards that reflect the highest that we expect as a society and not the lowest that we will accept. I think our District Attorney John Holmes said it pretty well this morning. This is the true meaning, this really is the true measure of leadership. Now, what I've just briefly sketched out here tonight is really a fairly ambitious agenda, if you think about it, to address these three broad domestic challenges. Moreover, it's one where sharp differences still exist over specific programs and specific policies. But I would submit to you that we are today witnessing the emergence of a national consensus on at least the general direction that we would like our society to take towards more robust and broad-based growth, towards more effective and accountable government, and towards greater emphasis upon personal responsibility. I think that the recent campaign clearly indicates that there's broad agreement, at least within the political mainstream, on the need to move forward with a domestic agenda that is aimed at achieving these important goals. Both Democrats and Republicans promised to increase economic growth, they promised to curb the deficit, and they promised to reduce regulation. Both Democrats and Republicans hail efforts to promote closer state and federal cooperation, devolution, if you will. Both Democrats and Republicans stress the concept of personal responsibility as a central tenet of American life. But we all know, particularly those of us who have been in politics for a while, that rhetoric is one thing and action is another. It's really not enough to talk the talk. You have to walk the walk. Only time will tell whether the President and the Congress are going to be able to move from agreement in principle to something approaching effective common purpose. We would be wise, I think, to recall the words of Abraham Lincoln during an earlier period of extraordinary change and challenge in our nation's history. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present, he wrote in 1862. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Our case, like Lincoln's, is new. Like him, we need to put aside the preconceived notions and the petty partisanship that constrain the range of our aspiration and that limit the scope of our action. We must indeed act anew. But as Lincoln reminds us, first, we have to think anew. If this conference helps us to do so, if it enriches our understanding of where we share common ground and encourages a constructive dialogue where differences of opinion divide us, then I, for one, will count it as a great success. Thank all of you for your contribution to it. Thank you very much.